Good evening and welcome to our special coverage of the coronavirus crisis. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. This deadly contagion is continuing to spread across the globe. There are now confirmed cases in the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, North America and the Middle East. And there's no end in sight. The virus, which causes pneumonia-like symptoms, has killed more than 560 people and infected more than 28,000, the vast majority of them in Hubei province in central China. It's shut down some international travel to and from China and prompted authorities there to quarantine most of their major cities. Tonight, we take you to the front line of the fight against the epidemic. We look at the timeline of the key events that have led to the worldwide health emergency. We'll cross to Christmas Island, where Australian families have been quarantined after being evacuated from the centre of the outbreak. Later, we'll talk to our panel of experts about how far this new coronavirus could spread, the symptoms and how you can reduce your risk of infection. Australian scientists are leading the world in searching for a cure. We'll also take a look at the disinformation since this outbreak and separate the facts from the fake. Plus, we'll examine the economic impact of the virus and the surge of racism and discrimination against people of Chinese or Asian descent. Let's begin, though, with our China correspondent Bill Birtles in Beijing.
In the world's most populous country, confirmed coronavirus cases are surging by more than 2,000 a day. But there are fears the real number of both cases and deaths may be higher, with reports of ill patients turned away from overwhelmed hospitals. China's leader Xi Jinping says he wants officials to make reducing the number of infections and deaths the top priority, vowing to slay what he calls the devil virus. It began in Wuhan and is now sowing fear across the world. Late last year, Chinese authorities say the first case of the mysterious virus is identified in Wuhan, a city of 11 million people in central Hubei province. But it would be weeks before Chinese authorities disclose this information to the public. Patients present with symptoms including high fever, coughing and difficulty breathing.
I said early on that it might not be so bad, but I've realised very quickly that this is a virus that transmits very quickly, and a small percentage of people that get it severely, and pneumonia, and it can be deadly.
China informs the World Health Organization about a viral pneumonia. Patients are quarantined and work begins on identifying the origins of the virus. The first clue was several of those infected worked in the city's Huanan seafood and animal wholesale market. The origins of the virus have been linked to illegally traded wildlife at the site, which sells wild game including wolf cubs, bats, beavers and snakes. The market is shut down. In the coming days, the number of confirmed cases jumps to 40.
It started maybe in November or December, and the incubation period is on average 5 days, not 2 weeks. And the transmission coefficient is 3, so every one case in a population which is at risk produces 3. So by April there could be many millions of cases if we don't get on top of this as quickly as possible.
Chinese officials rule out the possibility that this is a recurrence of the deadly severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, which infected more than 8,000 people and killed more than 700. 2 days later, the WHO confirms Chinese scientists have isolated the pathogen, named 2019 nCoV, a new strain of the coronavirus family, which includes the common cold and the deadly SARS virus. The disease spreads through close proximity to an infected person and inhaling droplets generated when they cough or sneeze. The first death of a 61-year-old man from Wuhan is linked to a pneumonia-like disease. A day later, Chinese authorities post the genetic blueprint of the novel coronavirus online as scientists scramble to figure out the mutated virus.
In the lab, you can develop tests for detecting the virus in people's blood or in their respiratory systems. So having the virus is really helpful to detection, to treatment and prevention. Some people are working on a vaccine. That generally takes 4 to 6 months. If we had the very best circumstances and the best of scientific luck, we could perhaps have something in 2 to 3 months, but I don't think any earlier.
The infection has a relatively low mortality rate, less than 2%, and Most had pre-existing conditions, but unlike SARS, the infection rate is spreading faster and higher. By mid-January, the virus has spread beyond China's borders for the first time, with cases reported in Thailand and then Japan. In both cases, the patients had travelled from Wuhan. In the following days, it will hit South Korea, the US and Taiwan. Chinese officials confirm human-to-human transmission as the number of infections skyrockets. Australia ramps up biosecurity protocols at all airports for passengers arriving from China. To give you an idea of just how quickly the virus has spread, here's what it looked like on the 20th of January, 291 confirmed cases. Just 2 weeks later, there are more than 24,000 cases. Hospitals in Wuhan are overwhelmed by the flood of patients and a lack of supplies. The next day, Beijing shuts down bus services into the capital, and Hubei province is all but cut off with more than 56 million residents confined indoors. Fears grow ahead of Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations, which sees hundreds of millions of people across China travel. By the 24th of January, dozens are confirmed dead and thousands more infected as the virus spreads to Europe for the first time. Scientists around the world scramble to understand the new viral strain and to look for a vaccine. Australia records its first case of coronavirus. In Wuhan, they begin to build 2 1,000-bed hospitals to help deal with the outbreak. Incredibly, they will open both within just 10 days. The Morrison government begins working on a plan to evacuate Australian citizens, including 100 children who are trapped in the epicentre of the deadly outbreak.
30, so that's 3 logs, so 1,000 times stronger.
Awesome.
So it's definitely growing.
So we've got it. Fantastic.
Scientists in Melbourne successfully grow the virus in cell culture, the first steps in treating the infection and minimising transmission.
We got our first patient on Friday, and we've successfully grown the virus from that patient. This will be a game changer for other labs within Australia, because at the moment no other labs really have positive control material to run their assays.
The World Health Organization declares a global emergency as total registered infections surpass those of SARS as the virus spreads to the Middle East. 2 people with coronavirus are isolated in the Gold Coast University Hospital after taking the Tiger Airways flight from Melbourne. The first death outside China is reported in the Philippines. There are now 13 confirmed cases in Australia. The Australians trapped in Wuhan are evacuated to Christmas Island, where they will be quarantined for 14 days. 2 days later, Australians are among dozens of people who have tested positive to the virus on board a cruise ship, which is off the Japanese port of Yokohama. Nearly 4,000 passengers and crew on the Diamond Princess have been put into mandatory quarantine for 2 weeks. But there are glimmers of hope. Some patients are responding to a cocktail of HIV and flu drugs.
I mistook this virus early on. I didn't realise it might have been as severe as it's turned out to be. So I'm watching closely to see how it evolves. I think we can continue to do well in Australia if we stay focused, and if we look out for each other, and if we support each other.
But misinformation about the outbreak is spreading faster than the virus. From conspiracy theories in China that the virus has been cooked up by the US to target the Chinese, to opposite theories that it's been released by a rogue state to infect the West, to downright dangerous cures.
We've seen misinformation spread about the coronavirus faster and further than the actual virus itself. It's just gone all over social media, everything from kind of innocuous mistakes that have travelled a long way to quite insidious conspiracy theories, pushing agendas and potentially putting people at harm.
In a rare display, the tech giants are working with local health authorities to combat the fake news.
When people search for stuff about the coronavirus, they'll direct people to places like the WHO to show, this is where you should be getting your information. These are the sources that can be trusted. They're also kind of doing a bit more to call out, misinformation that is spreading on their platform. So hoaxes or conspiracy theories that are being spread quite far, what they've got, like in the case of Facebook, is they've got independent fact-checking partners who can identify these conspiracy theories or hoaxes and then say, well, these contain false information. So if a user sees them, it'll have a kind of disclaimer saying this has been identified to have false information, and they'll try to limit the spread of that.
A deeply troubling side effect from the coronavirus has been the acts of racism against people of Chinese and Asian descent in the wake of the outbreak.
We looked at a list of Australian, kind of far-right Facebook pages in the wake of the coronavirus and looked at what they were kind of putting out, and there were a lot of them posting about the coronavirus, using that to push an idea of halting immigration into Australia from China altogether. And these posts which they had put out there, they were performing really well. Like, their audiences were lapping that up, they were liking, they were sharing, meaning that this message was going to go even further.
There is no doubt the coronavirus will have a huge impact on the global economy. The Chinese government has injected $258 billion to prop up its economy, and Australian Treasurer Josh Frydenberg warns it will have an impact on the nation's bottom line, not least the multi-billion-dollar university and tourism sectors, which are worried they will take a massive hit as a result of the outbreak. There are growing fears the coronavirus could become a pandemic. At least one, the 2009 swine flu, killed 200,000 people. With no vaccine or treatment to prevent it yet, containing its spread is now vital.
That report was from our China correspondent Bill Birtles, who's just finished spending 14 days in quarantine after reporting from Wuhan. And our reporter James Carmody is on Christmas Island, where Australian evacuees are being held. They both join us now. Bill, to you first, what is it like in Beijing right now?
Well, Jeremy, it's awfully quiet. There aren't many people around on the streets for a city of 22 million people. It's incredibly quiet. Doesn't mean people aren't here. A lot of those travellers who didn't cancel their Lunar New Year plans, they've returned to the city in recent days because the holiday is now over. But most people here are heeding government advice to stay indoors, don't go out. The shops are closed, the restaurants are closed. So it is pretty quiet.
James, you've been speaking with some of the Australians who are at that evacuation point on Christmas Island. How are they faring in these conditions?
Jeremy, initially some of the evacuees were uneasy about the detention centre, and there were a few complaints about conditions. But the people I spoke with today through the fence seemed relaxed and say that they're comfortable inside and are being well looked after. I spoke with Queensland man Wayne Binney, who says that getting out of Wuhan with his wife and daughter was such a nightmare that he's just grateful to be back on Australian soil.
I think that whatever's happened, well thought through. There's always two sides to the political argument. But for us, just to be on Australian soil is a relief, Because as long as we're away from where the problem is, and of course, if anybody here was infected, at least it's not going to, the spread of the virus or whatever is contained, and that's probably the best thing for Australian people.
Some evacuees told us that given the next group of evacuees is flying to the Northern Territory, they too would have rather been quarantined on the Australian mainland, but they say they're comfortable in the detention centre. And we're told that while no more evacuees are expected to be sent here, there may be some once the first group is able to leave here. But the locals here are hopeful that that doesn't occur because they're looking forward to seeing their usually quiet island return to its regular, peaceful existence.
Bill, a question to you. How are Chinese people feeling about the way the government there, the health authorities are managing this crisis and the sort of information that's being released to the public?
Well, Jeremy, the news overnight that the whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang died has caused absolute anger and sadness across China's internet, but everybody is talking about this. On the street, people are talking about this. The sadness is obvious. This guy is being hailed as a hero for spreading the news of this dangerous virus before authorities were willing to do so. But the anger relates to two things. A, the way he was treated originally, where he was accused of spreading rumours. B, when he died, the authorities looks like they sent out some misinformation claiming he was still alive for several more hours in what many here believe is an attempt to quell the anger. So this is fueling concerns that although the Chinese government appears to be a lot more open and transparent now compared to SARS 17 years ago, let's face it, that was a very low bar, they nonetheless are not giving the full picture, and many people here are deeply sceptical of the information.
Bill Birtles in Beijing, James Carmody on Christmas Island. Thank you both for joining us. So with us now to discuss the outbreak in more detail is Professor Tania Sorrell. She's an internationally renowned expert on infectious diseases. She's the director of the Marie Bashir Institute for Infectious Diseases and Biosecurity. Joining us from Canberra is the infectious diseases physician, Associate Professor Sanjaya Senanayake from the Australian National University. And in Melbourne, we have the economist Angela Jackson. Professor Sorrell, first to you, how worried should we be about this virus?
At the present time, it's really very well contained in Australia. Clearly, there are a vast number of cases in China. We know that it's not as severe and doesn't cause the same mortality rate as, say, with SARS and MERS, which are the most similar coronaviruses, but we know that the number of cases is larger. Fortunately, the evidence so far is that they're at the milder end of the spectrum. But as far as worry in Australia, we're in a containment phase. We have very few cases and we are containing it so that it's not really being secondarily spread at this point in time.
Sanjaya Senanayake, can I ask you, is this potentially worse than we're being told?
Look, I think within Australia, I agree with what Tania says. I think that we are containing this virus, we're identifying cases and isolating them. So it's not an issue in Australia. Now, what is happening in China is hard to fathom. They are in lockdown, and it is quite possible that there are things going on that we don't know. We are coming towards the end of the 2 weeks since the lockdown was instituted. And if it is starting to work, in the next few days, we might start to see a plateauing and a falling of cases, but it's hard to say.
Angela Jackson, these quarantining measures, the panic that we're seeing, what is it doing to the economy globally?
Oh, look, it's a major risk at the moment to the global economy. So, China is incredibly important, much more important than when SARS happened. So when SARS occurred 20 years ago, China was only 4% of the economy. World economy today, it's 16%, and it's responsible for around 40% of economic growth. So there are real concerns, again, that if the lockdown hasn't worked and the epidemic continues in China and the slowdown in manufacturing in China continues for another 2 weeks, could be months, that there will be a global economic downturn as a result.
Tania Sorrell, how reliable are the official figures that we're receiving from national and international bodies about the spread of this virus and the death rates?
Look, I think the figures from China are almost necessarily unreliable because of the vast number of cases and the fact that many would not be being formally diagnosed or even documented. Outside of China, I believe the numbers are accurate. If one thinks of the countries in which cases are being reported, there are generally very good public health systems and a lot of attention being paid to trying to identify people with this virus so that spread can be prevented.
Sanjaya Senanayake, Indonesia is one of those countries that isn't reporting any cases of infection so far. This is an enormous country, a huge population with a very, very vast border, and yet no cases of infection picked up there. Does that concern you?
Well, as Tania was saying, one would hope that all countries are identifying cases, but we don't know if that's the case. So it is quite possible that Indonesia does have some transmission, but at the same time that their public health infrastructure is doing the job and stopping any secondary transmission or identification of any cases there at all.
Do you detect, Sanjaya Senanayake, that there is a degree of support for the quarantining measures that have been announced in Australia?
Yes, I do overall. Within Australia and globally, some other countries are instituting similar practices. And we do know throughout the centuries, in recent times and in the past, that isolating uninfected people from people who have infection and other sources of infection until they are no longer infectious works. So we've seen that with the Ebola outbreak 5 years ago in West Africa. We've seen that with SARS about 17 years ago, and even going back 600 years when Venice was trying to prevent the Black Plague ravaging its city. It works.
Angela Jackson, the Chinese government has criticised Australia for overreacting in the way it's responded to treating Chinese citizens who were heading to Australia or warning Australians who were heading to China. Does that risk undermining the bilateral relationship?
Look, I guess the issue for us is that the World Health Organisation advises against the sort of travel bans that Australia has implemented. So for us to explain to China and to manage that relationship about why we thought it was necessary in this instance is vitally important, because we have to recognise that we're going against what the World Health Organisation is saying. But look, in the long run, the relationship between China and Australia is a long one and an important one to both countries, but we do need to manage it at this time.
Is there a potential, Tania Sorrell, that those who are afraid of being caught up in these quarantining measures may look to sort of go underground and therefore drive the kind of disinformation, the misinformation we're seeing, and the lack of sort of policing that's necessarily difficult about how this is managed?
The social media really, as you indicated in your introductory part of this session, is clearly creating almost a secondary viral infection, if you like, but a virus of a different sort. And there is a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and concern within the community. I think this is really one of the most important elements that we actually have to deal with in parallel with the actual viral infection itself.
Angela Jackson, can I bring you in here with this point about the panic that comes from disinformation and misinformation? That does have a very significant flow-on effect to the economy when that sort of panic spreads so readily, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, in many ways, the biggest risk to the global economy at the moment is that panic and that we overreact rather than the actual cases themselves. I think, as it's been pointed out, in Australia we have relatively few cases. It's being very well managed. There really isn't a lot to worry about. But panic can take over, and people, in particular, when there is uncertainty around an illness or a disease or a risk, people can, think that it's a bigger issue than maybe it really is. So it's important we listen to the World Health Organisation, that we listen to the chief medical officers around Australia and take their advice about how to manage our risk in this instance. It's not about avoiding people from a Chinese background. It's the basic hygiene of washing your hands and taking those basic precautions that always protect you against the risk of infection.
So Jason Anoka, as a medical professional, how do you combat that misinformation, the disinformation that's out there?
Look, I think it's really important to find good sources of information in the media. ABC News is one. I think I found it very reliable for those people with a medical interest. New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, they're all JAMA, they're all very reliable. But for the general public, go to the Australian Department of Health website. Go to your state and territory health websites. They will have up-to-date, accurate information.
Professor Sorrell, why is there so much focus on coronavirus when we know there are so many other diseases that killed vastly more people throughout history, even in recent times?
I think this virus is a new virus. We don't really understand a great deal about its biology or its spread, or are we well able to really predict the future with it? And it's the element of uncertainty which is really very distressing and anxiety provoking. We have figures that suggest a mortality which is almost certainly higher than the true situation, because the figures on which it's based come from reported cases and known cases, and there is a large spectrum, we believe, where the infection is fairly mild, and therefore if we look at the true mortality rate, it's likely to be a lot lower than even 2%.
Sanjaya Senanayake, you're nodding your head there. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yes, look, from an infectious diseases and public health point of view, the outbreak that scares us is the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed about 40 to 50 million people within a very short period of time, and they were young, healthy people. So we're always thinking about a species depleting event. So we always get worried when a new virus appears. We're only 8 weeks into this outbreak, so we're still learning about it. But it does look like this is not going to be anything like 1918. It looks like it's highly infectious. It looks like it has a very low death rate. So even if it did spread to Australia, it would cause a lot of inconvenience for a period of time, but it would not be the end of the world.
Tania Sorrell, there's a point that's been really well made in the last few weeks, that there are people who've been studying coronavirus for years and years and years, and it's not one of your superstar diseases necessarily, but thank goodness we've had those people working in this area to be able to get at least a bit of a head start on it.
It's really been a very important learning experience having to deal with SARS and MERS, and you're quite correct. There are a large number of scientists really working on all aspects of this type of infection worldwide, not only in terms of understanding it, but also developing new treatments and actually having at hand the important molecular and genetic tools that can be rapidly put into place and used to learn more about this particular virus.
So how long, Tania Sorrell, will it take to reach the point where a vaccine is readily available?
It's a difficult question to answer, I guess, accurately, but if we look at the teams that are doing work at the moment, the expectation is that even as soon as within 2 months they will understand and have, if you like, a template for a vaccine, but it's then got to be trialled in animals and then in humans to make sure that it's both effective and not likely to have side effects. So I would suggest that 6 months would be very rapid, but if we're particularly lucky and things go according to plan with the scientific research, it could be as short as 4 months.
Sanjaya Senanayake, your view on how long that process might take?
No, I agree with Tania. I would have thought 4 to 6 months is pretty optimistic. But even if it takes a long time, there is speculation that this virus might end up being a seasonal virus like influenza. So it might pop up every winter and cause a bit of mayhem. So I think even if it takes that extra time to develop the vaccine, it's a good idea.
Angela Jackson, 2 months in scientific terms is quite incredible, but from an economic point of view, that's a crisis.
Yeah, that's a crisis, and that is the problem that we're facing at the moment. I think the economic models that are looking at sort of 2% reduction in GDP growth in China are factoring in a 2, maybe 3 week shutdown. If we're talking about 4 months, then we have serious problems.
So what does that do to the Australian economy over 2 months, 3 months, 6 months?
Look, obviously tourist numbers will drop. We have the university students, 100,000 of them who are waiting to come into Australia right now, and we're not sure what's going to happen there. That's a huge economic cost, and it might also undermine some of the viability of some of our universities, which is another risk. Going forward, you are talking about global supply chains being affected here. All the global companies are now very interrelated and rely on components from China, so manufacturing around the world might be impacted. This will have, grave economic repercussions for Australia if it goes on for much longer than sort of 2 to 3 weeks. So certainly 4 months would be catastrophic.
Well, I'd like to thank all our guests, Professor Tania Sorrell, Associate Professor Sanjaya Senanayake and Angela Jackson. We'll continue bringing you developments on this coronavirus on ABC News across all our platforms to keep you in touch with this very fast-moving story. For now, though, from all of us, good night.